belonging to this event to celebrate Black History Month. It is just, I think, really wonderful to see so many people in our community here to support this event. And this is like one of the first events I've ever put on here at BGSU, so I'm just like really excited. Thank you so much for coming. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce my dear friend who is our speaker today. Her name is Modupe Labode. She is a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and she is a curator of African American social justice history. She is also the chair of the African American History Curatorial Collective, and she is on the staff of the Center of Restorative History, where she is the lead of the Emmett Historic Marker Project. She is also a producer and researcher of the Collective podcast, which just launched its second season last Thursday. And that podcast this season focuses on Black women and music and disability history. We were just chatting about it. It's just super awesome. So definitely look that up and check it out. So before coming to the Smithsonian, Modupe taught history and museum studies at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, where she was a public scholar of African American history and museums. She has also taught at Iowa State University and was the chief historian at the Colorado Historical Society, which is now History Colorado. She earned her doctorate degree at Oxford University and her undergraduate degree at Iowa State. Modupe's areas of interest include the history of monuments and commemoration, Black public art, African American history of the Midwest and West, and public interpretations of Black history at museums and public history sites. I'll also say that we met through the most fabulous organization ever. It's the National Council of Public History, where you are still co-chair of the diversity.
Yes.
Yeah, the IDEA committee, which is the diversity committee there. And so that's how we met in our work. And you're just like the most awesome person. So we're so excited to have you here today.
Well, I am, thank you. And so I really appreciate Dr. Dong. This was an amazing introduction. I'm going to turn on my microphone. Am I mic'd? Great. Okay. Thank you. And I am so pleased to be here with you today. And as Cheryl said, I'm a curator at the National Museum of American History, which is part of the Smithsonian. And I've worked there since 2019. And so speaking about work that I've done with my colleagues there, but one of the things I'll just be very clear about is I'm speaking on my own behalf. I'm not speaking as an official representative of the Smithsonian or the federal government. And I'm not speaking on behalf of our many community partners in this project. So the first slide I have here is an exhibition view of the exhibition Reckoning with Remembrance, which was an exhibit project that we co-curated, we being in this case, the Smithsonian curators, with various communities in the Mississippi Delta. It's an unusual project for the museum because it's community co-curated, but it also is unusual because it's one object. So it's fairly common in art museums to have a single object museum, exhibit, I should say. But for history museums, we tend to like put a lot of things, one after the other. So part of the reason it's a one object exhibit is because of the nature in which it was defaced. So this historical marker has about 300 odd indentations or bullet holes in it. And so the violence with which it was treated is part of its significance. So today I'd like to talk for around 30 minutes and then leave some time for discussion. And just as a roadmap for my discussion, there's several facets for this. One is, or kind of themes that you'll see come through here. One is the history of Emmett Till and the history of commemoration of his life and legacy and his afterlife. The second is how this marker came into the museum, which might be also a way for you to think about how do objects get into museums in the first place? And then by telling this story, I hope to also give you an indication of this very deep collaboration between the Smithsonian Museum, the National Museum of American History, and the and communities in the Mississippi Delta, because it reveals the possibilities that are inherent in long-term community-based collaborations. And I'm not saying that all collaborations need to work this way. Some collaborations can be purely transactional, just saying like a community wants some of the expertise that public historians or museums have. Those are delivered. I've worked on those projects. But this is a project that has kind of taken some interesting and I think unique turns, partly because the communities themselves have been so invested in telling these stories and telling the stories about the life and afterlife of Emmett Till. So this is the marker itself, and most of the things that I will be discussing today take place in Tallahatchie County. Now, this part of the, as well as most of what is now the state of Mississippi, were the homelands of the Choctaw people. And there's still a federally recognized Choctaw tribe in Mississippi. And so Tallahatchie is an anglicized form of the word Rock River or River of Rocks. And the Tallahatchie River kind of meanders through Mississippi. It has different kind of manifestations, different meanings in different parts of the state, just like the Mississippi River has different meanings in different parts of North America. The Choctaw people were brutally wrenched from the land by European and American settlers, and the people that came in included enslaved Africans. So there is evidence, as in many parts of the US, of some interactions between indigenous people and enslaved people. So this narrative picks up, I just want to say a little bit about Emmett Till in case people aren't familiar with his story. He was a 14-year-old African-American boy who grew up in Chicago. Like many people, Black people in Chicago, his mother landed there as part of the Great Migration. She was born in Drew, Mississippi, which is in Tallahatchie County. One of his relatives, Moses Wright, was visiting, and Emmett was a very charming kid by all accounts. He was kind of a jokester, and he really loved his Mississippi relatives, and they arranged that he would go down to Mississippi when his uncle returned. So although his mother warned her son that, being Black could get you killed in Mississippi, he was also a teenager, which means that you may or may not take seriously what your mother tells you. An incident occurred in a store in Money, Mississippi, between Till and a white woman named Carolyn Bryant. His cousins said he whistled at her. There were numerous slanderous stories saying that he did more. Some people deny that he whistled at all, but because his cousins were the ones that said that he whistled, the museum has used that interpretation. The kids were panicked immediately because even if Emmett didn't know the implications of his goofing around, they did. And they ran away, and they made the decision, which many young people would do, is they decided they wouldn't tell their uncle what happened. 3 days later, initially the kids thought they had kind of ducked something. 3 days later, in the middle of the night, at least 2 armed men invaded Moses Wright's house. They had flashlights and they took Emmett Till from his bed. This was the last time anybody saw him. These men put Emmett Till in the back of a pickup. They drove him around the counties. into Sunflower County. They tortured him, they shot him, and they tied a neck around his dead body and threw him in the Tallahatchie River, where it was eventually recovered. He was the third person lynched in that area in as many months. So his mother, when his body was recovered, his mother, Mamie Till, I'm going to call her Mamie Till Mobley, that was the name she had when she died, held an open casket funeral in Chicago. In Mississippi, there was a very quick trial, and the jury of white men deliberated for about an hour before they acquitted the men. J.D. Bryant and his half-brother Milam later sold their story to a national magazine in which they freely admitted their guilt. Because of the concept of double jeopardy in our law, they could not be tried again. It is highly likely that there were more people involved in Emmett Till's kidnapping, torture, and murder than we will know. The lynching and the verdict and the image of Emmett Till in Jet magazine electrified and terrified young Black people around the country. A wide range of people testified to this, famous people you might know like Rosa Parks, the late Congressman John Lewis, Claudette Colvin, who in Montgomery, Alabama, had just been going through, like a lot of young people in Montgomery. One of her classmates was being tried for a capital crime of supposedly raping a white woman. He was involved with a consensual sexual relationship, but he was later found guilty of rape and electrocuted. So she felt that she was being assaulted by all sides of the death of people that were either her age or people she cared about. I remember the first time I saw that picture. It was long after Emmett Till's death, and it was very difficult to even believe that somebody would do anything like this. Claudette Colvin spoke for many young people when she said if they were going to do that to a young person, they being white supremacists, white people, anything could happen. And for some people, this meant that they were ready to, that they kind of in some ways lost their fear. The people who first commemorated Emmett Till's death were Mamie Till Mobley, his mother, the NAACP, churches, and labor unions. They spoke around the country trying to raise awareness of his death. And although there were countless poems and songs composed also to educate, but in many ways, Till's family, people in Chicago, and people in Mississippi were shaped by loss. It really took knowing and learning more about Black history to even know the context in which Emmett Till was murdered. And in Mississippi, this story was suppressed. So a person could grow up in Tallahatchie County, where Emmett Till was visiting, where the trial was held, and not know anything that had happened. One of those people who grew up in Tallahatchie County was a Black man named Jerome G. Little, who was a very young child when Emmett Till was murdered, but he didn't know any of his county's connection to the Emmett Till until he went into the military service in the 1970s. And his fellow servicemen were telling him, don't you know, like this happened in your county. He returned to the Tallahatchie County after being in the service and started getting involved in electoral politics and organizing. In Mississippi, it took numerous lawsuits under the Voting Rights Act before there was reorganization of the polls and redistricting, allowing Black people to not only vote, but the vote to be counted. And he organized a group of people who called themselves the Magnificent Seven to run for elected office in Tallahatchie County. And he became in the late 1990s, he became the first Black president of the Board of Supervisors, which is the highest office in the county. Now, what was interesting about the Magnificent Seven and their allies was that they were community organizers, and they also believed that Black history should be taught. Because in Mississippi public schools, it was largely not taught. So they looked to public history, what we would call public history largely, to teach Black history. And they formed the Emmett Till Memorial Commission in 2006, a interracial group of people, and which issued an apology to Till's family for this county's role in justifying his murder. And around that time, they also started a whole series of historical markers, including this one, marking sites associated with Emmett Till's murder. This site was the river site, which is where Emmett Till's body was recovered. And so what was interesting is they saw historical recovery also associated with other forms of recovery, like economic recovery, clean water, dealing with the judicial system. Parchman Prison, which some of you may have heard about, like in Blue Zones, is basically a hop, skip, and a jump from Tallahatchie County. So it really dominates the employment, and also it dominates many people's lives because that's where they've been imprisoned. So my colleagues, all that's to say is that this is one of the commission's markers, and it was placed before any of the state of Mississippi's historical markers. So this was a community-based effort. And many of these markers were attacked in numerous ways. The Riverside marker, this is the second marker that was placed at the Riverside. 3 of them were destroyed. And one of them you might be familiar with. This is in 2019, the image on the left. These are young white guys from a fraternity in the University of Mississippi who posed and post to social media images of attacking the Emmett Till marker. The image on the right is the one in our, it's an image that the Memorial Commission took on site from when it was destroyed in 2017. There's now a bulletproof sign there. So the news of the fraternity brothers and was how my colleagues at the museum first became aware of this historical marker. And they wondered if it belonged in the National Museum of American History. Many times curators have the ability, they often don't purchase things, but they might ask people to donate things. And so they wondered if it belonged there. If this story, which is profoundly local, but also has national resonances, how would it change if it was in the National Museum of American History? And they did something really interesting. Is they spent over 2 weeks off and on in Mississippi in 2019 and 2020, just before the pandemic, and interviewed people all over the state. So in the Delta, but also in Jackson and in southern parts of Mississippi. And this is just kind of a sampling of the various people they interviewed, asking them, do you think this would this marker going to the Smithsonian be seen as stealing heritage, stealing local history? Or is there a national, we know there's a national story, but does it belong there? And people have all sorts of opinions about it. But what came most clear was that if the marker went to the National Museum of American History, it has to tell the Mississippi story of Emmett Till's life and death, but also the efforts it takes to teach Black history, to have Black public history in Mississippi. So eventually the marker was donated, and it was on display for a few months in 2021. So when an object comes in our museum, it does not necessarily mean that it's going to be on exhibit. Most objects do not go on exhibit. But because of because of the significance of this object, because of the community engagement, but also because of the pandemic, there were opportunities to display this. So the pandemic meant that there were far fewer visitors in the museum. And so what the designers and my colleagues did was that they created an exhibit that is in Flag Hall. So you see that kind of abstract representation of the US flag. If you go into the doors on either side, that's where the Star Spangled Banner is displayed. So if somebody wants to see the Star Spangled Banner, they have to pass through here. And further, because of the pandemic, the museum only had one entrance, and that entrance led directly into Flag Hall. So anyone coming into the museum had to encounter this object. And so there's enormous significance to this. What does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to be an American? What is American violence? It received a lot of press, but also the museum, my colleagues provided a platform for community members to really tell their story of how they were involved in reviving Emmett Till's history and thinking about what the legacy of that is in the counties in Mississippi. And so if you're a person who's kind of a nerd, you can look up these symposium on, I shouldn't say a nerd, I love C-SPAN myself. Not many people spend a lot of time watching C-SPAN, but if you're interested, you can see the community members, including Reverend Parker, Wheeler Parker, who is the only surviving person to witness Emmett Till's kidnapping, talk about what this exhibit and also what their other efforts to commemorate Emmett Till's life and death meant. So after the exhibit closed in 2019, it had only been up for 2 months, and in 2019 and 2020, I'm sorry, after it closed in 2021, once an exhibit closes, we usually think that's it. But my colleagues when they were engaging with the communities in Mississippi, they were using a concept that that we borrowed from archaeologists to call mutual capacity building. So that when we've taken the object, when we put the object in the property of the National Museum of American History for the American people, we didn't want to just extract it from the community. We asked community members, what did they want from the Smithsonian? How could we help them tell their stories? Because many of them said there is a huge amount of tourism in the Mississippi Delta. It's usually blues tourism. There's a little bit of civil rights tourism, but by comparison, the civil rights infrastructure is not the same as the blues tourism. Many people, they like the blues, they love the blues, but they weren't really happy with how the blues is portrayed nationally. So many of them are interested in telling the story of Emmett Till and civil rights in the Mississippi in a very long way, in looking at the ways in which Black people in Mississippi have always organized to preserve their own rights. So whether you're talking about enslaved people, whether you're talking about tenant farmers, there was actually a really brutal massacre of Black tenant farmers who had organized with white tenant farmers to push against the tenant system. People who use culture, especially quilting and music, but also civil rights activism. They wanted to tell those stories in their own words, and they said, you guys are experts in that. So we want you to at least give us some, we know that you can't tell us, take you to museum studies school, but we want you to give us some indication about how we can tell our own stories, but also how we can still tell our own stories to one another. Like we have songs, we have narratives and so on, but what if a church wants to have its own exhibit about its history? How do we do that? And so this is about the time I've kind of cycled into the project. And we had two workshops in Mississippi. The first one, this is the image of, we called Our Stories, Our Power. And just the list of organizations that came there was important because one of the things is, as the Smithsonian, we wouldn't want to see it as playing favorites, one group against another group, but also a lot of times in a place where there's tourism, there's a lot of competition for tourist dollars. And wanted to say that interpretation, the skills of interpretation is something that should be available to anyone for whatever they wanted. So we knew it was a one-day workshop. It's not going to solve everything, but it's getting people on a path. And I will also say that the community just kind of hanging around with people, talking and eating amazing food. I'm somebody that does not eat meat, and so if you know Southern food, there's usually a nice piece of pork floating in that. So people were kind of, there were several of us vegetarians, and there was a lot of effort to make sure that people had their own vegetarian potato salad and their own vegetarian, and like the vegetables were prepared vegetarian style. And one of the things about community building is a huge amount of hospitality and just sitting and listening. And the things that we heard were really, I think were really important as far as kind of even understanding what we at the Smithsonian had been up to. Because one of the things it brings attention to areas, but trying not to have kind of attention that just goes to one group versus another. So this was one workshop. The other workshop my colleagues led was how to use your phone to make movies. These workshops are everywhere. People, in this case, we had some filmmakers do this. And it's really powerful. Like for me, I'm not a movie maker. I don't make videos, but learning how to look at the world in a different way about what are you going to highlight? What do you see? The filmmaker had her initial exercise was what image do you think about when you think about your home? And that was, just flowering of ideas and using that as a way of saying, use that to make a movie that other people can look at. So that was part of our mutual capacity building. And at the same time, we had an interesting opportunity arise. And in the museum had a glitch in its exhibit schedule. I shouldn't say glitch. There were some unexpected developments, which meant that there was a gallery that was open. And in that gallery, the director said, why don't you reinstall the Emmett Till historical marker? So that's how I became the co-curator of that. And this is the image of the Reckoning with Remembrance. So if we had the same panels that had been there before, but there were other ideas that we needed to communicate. We wanted to make sure that the visitors may or may not be coming to the museum to see this exhibit. If you've been in our museum, it's usually kind of I would say a little bit lighthearted. There's serious topics, but it isn't something that if you go to probably any African-American museum or a Jewish museum or a museum of Japanese or Chinese in America, you will be confronted with very heavy topics. Our museum hasn't historically done that. So we want to make sure that visitors are prepared for that, which also involved a huge amount of exhibit design. And one of the things this is the layout, and I won't really burden you too much with that, but one of the things that we created was this wall here, so that people could not look into the exhibit and see the historical marker without any interpretation. The outside of this area is basically a passageway. There's a couple big objects, but people are talking, they're laughing, they're going up and down the escalator. And we knew that we wanted a different mood in the exhibit than what was out of the exhibit, which also means preparing people for what they're going to see. So this is the external view of the exhibit. One of the things that the museum, and I should be saying, this is all being co-curated. I'll kind of delve into that in a minute, but we're running all the labels by the community members, a group of community members, not all of them, but a group that were interested in participating. So one of the things that's a little bit unusual, this is I love this picture, of Emmett Till and his mother. Part of it really shows that they thought the world of each other. This was their Christmas card in 1954. And they were very happy with each other. In our museum, you often don't see very large pictures of people. So this caught visitors' attention. It also let them know this is an exhibit about Black people. That even if there were some people who knew exactly who they were. And then there were other people who thought, well, this looks like an old time picture of some, probably a family. They weren't sure, but hoping that it would create some intrigue. From this angle, you can also see a video that I'll mention in a minute, but this person here is looking at this label. And this is the close-up of that label. And it says, this exhibition includes discussion of anti-Black violence, lynching, intimidation, shooting. Please exercise care for yourself and others. So our museum often doesn't have advisory labels in it. I don't think they've seen the need to. And in this case, we were really concerned more about preparing people. We knew that from anecdotal evidence, there were people who know exactly who Emmett Till was, and they said, I think this is really important, but I don't want to see anything that has to deal with the killing of that boy or lynching. Often these people were, they just felt kind of already traumatized by this, even as they supported the exhibition. There were other people who still don't know who Emmett Till is. And we wanted to kind of take the mood down a little bit. So to say, this is what's going to be, you're going to see. And also because gun violence is so prevalent in our country, one of the things that talking to people, again, anecdotally, we realized that a lot of people, when they saw that historic marker shot up, they felt very strong. They tended to be connecting it with killings. And we knew that we have no idea how many people have been affected by gun violence in their lives and wanted just to get themselves to be aware of that. And please exercise care for yourself and others. So we use the advice of Margaret Middleton, who is an exhibit developer. And she says, don't just tell people be careful, say why they should be careful, but also what they should do. And we kind of struggled a lot with this one, but part of it was just kind of being aware of your own emotions, but also for taking care of yourself and others, might it be, don't talk too much. Like, how are you going to think about the other people that you're in an exhibit with? Because a lot of times when I'm in an exhibit about dinosaurs, for example, I might be talking to the kid next to me because they know far more about dinosaurs than I do. But there's some exhibits you go into where you don't talk to other people. And this might be aware of your voice. It might be just aware that other people might be feeling emotional. So this was an interesting project. The other thing that we did was, this was a label that was co-curated with, actually it was just written by the community members. And this is how co-curation works. The community members wanted to indicate who they were. And so I wrote up a draft for one of our meetings and about who the community members were and how they came about to create the marker and their involvement in the exhibit. And when we had a meeting, which was over Zoom, when it was time to look at this potential label, there was a lot of quiet and very polite quietness. And someone said, finally, that just doesn't sound like us. And said, good, okay, how can I, help rewrite this? And one of the guys said, I'll just rewrite it. Because we don't talk about ourselves, like one said, like, we don't talk about ourselves as activists, we talk about ourselves as citizens. And citizens has a huge civil rights resonance, it has a big resonance because there are a lot of people from other parts that are predominantly Spanish speakers, from other parts of the Americas in the Mississippi Delta. It means people who are active. There's a Chinese community in the Mississippi Delta. So what he's talking about, he says, like we distinguish between citizens who are like standing up for themselves and others. So if you look at that in label, which is online, they wrote it. And basically we kind of copy edited it. The video here was, the Center for Restorative History had sent filmmakers to the Mississippi Delta to record interviews before we knew this exhibit was happening. And so this was in 2023. And they spent some time at Tallahatchie River. This is the site where the marker was. This is the site where Emmett Till's body was recovered. And so it was in July, the recovery was in August. And we were able to have a loop, I think of 90 seconds, and also audio from that, from the video. So the idea was not to pretend you're immersed in Mississippi, but to give an evocation of what the river looks like. For example, for me, the Mississippi River, I grew up in Eastern Iowa. That's whenever someone says a river, that's my idea of a river. And it's not judgment, but to say that this is what the Tallahatchie looks like in this part of the world. There's birds flying through, you can hear cicadas. We developed an developed an icon so that people who are hard of hearing know that there's audio going on, even if they can't hear it. But it transfixed a lot of people. And I think it wasn't kind of saying that you're, again, not in Mississippi, but invoking Mississippi. This is another view. This label was letting people know about that activism brought about the Emmett Till and Mamie Till National Monument, which is part of the National Park Service in Chicago and Mississippi. So people were very clear that they said, we have been trying to tell this story for decades. It wasn't the National Park Service that decided they wanted to commemorate this. It was people who urged them to do it. So that was a community written label, and this was a quotation from Reverend Wheeler Parker talking about the importance of Emmett Till's death and the racism that led to it, and that it is still continuing. So that was at the exhibit. We didn't have an exhibit opening, but I know I'm going long, so I'll just kind of note is that we had a series of workshops for community members in Mississippi, but also community members in Chicago. And we have to thank the National Park Service for making those introductions, because the National Museum of American History had largely been working with people in Mississippi. Chicago was where a lot of the family members were. Chicago is where Robert's Temple, the Church of God in Christ church, where Emmett Till's funeral was held, that's all in Chicago. Many people in Mississippi and Chicago sort of knew of each other, but they didn't know each other particularly well. So we had a workshop on July 30th, July 31st. We had a 2-day workshop and reception for community members from these groups. The National Park Service held a workshop for the African American Civil Rights Network, which is a really amazing project. So you can recognize historic structures, programs in your community that have not been designated historic structures before. So, for example, the funeral home where Emmett Till's body was prepared, which was, it's hard to overestimate the courage of the funeral directors and the porters who guarded Emmett Till's body as the train from Mississippi to Chicago. There are only parking lots or vacant structures where those are now. There's a historical marker, put up by the Emmett Memorial Commission, but also it can now be designated a significant site, even when the structure no longer exists. We had a great workshop in which educators from the Mississippi Delta, including people who led tours, they led workshops from young people, shared with educators from the DC area, museum educators and people from Chicago, their own tactics and strategies for talking about this history. And then, of course, we had a reception because food is very important. So these are just some images. These are we always have to have group images. This is a tour of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And if you ever have the chance to go there, that is where there's an extraordinary exhibition based around Emmett Till's casket that is in that museum. So they got a VIP tour of the museum. These are just images from the educators workshop. So there's various people who are learning from one another. And also from the educators workshop. And finally, in the reception, in addition to very good food, we had various kind of important people come to speak. We were hoping that representatives would come, but Congress was in session, so very DC thing. We had a former governor of Mississippi came to the reception to talk to people. The man in the National Park Service is representing the National Park Service. He's in full official uniform. And this is Reverend Parker, who is the witness of Emmett Till's relative. And Sonia Sanchez, who is a fairly renowned poet, recited 2 poems, including 14 haiku for Emmett Louis Till. And one of the remarkable things is she was saying those poems to the family members who were in the audience. It was tremendously moving. We are still embarked on trying to get the exhibit to tour in Mississippi. The Smithsonian usually doesn't do tours. That's not a thing it does. But we really that's part of our mutual capacity building. So having the exhibit on display for 6 months was remarkable, but the work is still ongoing. I know that I've gone a little bit long, but I just wanted to thank you very much and see if there's any questions.